Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome to this COP30 recap session. First, let me start off by saying how wonderful it is to see all of these sisters and folks from Peace Ministries and folks from the Water Spirit community here on this call. Something I really cherish about being in this community is that even when we're on Zoom, you are all so friendly and welcoming and are able to create that sense of community, across continents even right off the bat. So you have my appreciation and affection from the get-go. You also have a tremendous amount of gratitude from me. I've been able to represent the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace at the United Nations for the
Yep.
past 6 years, and I really
Mhm.
am joyful to be able to have this opportunity to do this high-level advocacy in that space on your behalf. I'm going to take us through a rather long PowerPoint presentation today. While I have my slides up, it will be tricky for me to see anything in the chat, but know that once I pull it down, I'm going to be able to look at your faces again and check the chat, and we'll have some time for question and answers. My hope with this presentation is to share a recap of COP30 that doesn't sound the same as any old article you might read in the newspaper about what happened. I want to share a few more specific stories and photos, drawing a little bit on what I know from about Brazil as well, from all the time that I got to live there, and some more focused reflections that are of more direct concern to faith-based organizations like ours and to the Water Spirit community as well. Let's see, what else? I want to thank Marcella specifically for helping to set up this call today. So thank you very much, my fellow UN representative. Really, really appreciate it. And I want to remind everybody that sometimes we don't even realize that sounds are going off in the room behind us when we're on Zoom calls. So if you would be so kind, I would like to ask you to mute your own microphones until we get to the question and answer portion. Clearly, if there's anything big that I should know and I'm just talking, 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 you can unmute and jump in and say, Blair, wait a minute. But other than that, let's just keep our microphones off until the end to make it easier for everybody to hear. If you don't know where to do that, you can go down on Zoom to the participants panel. Once you open up that participants panel, next to your name, you can click a little microphone to mute yourself, or also in that bar on the bottom, usually you can see a little microphone icon right away, and you can click on that to mute yourself as well. Okay, everybody. Um, well, I say let's get right down to it. I'm going to pull up my slides, and I'll see your faces in a little while. Okay. So we're titling today's talk, Taking Stock of COP30, and it'll become a little bit clearer why I chose that title by the end of this presentation. COP30 was the 30th Conference of the Parties, that's what COP stands for, of UN mechanism called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Every time the member states, that is the countries, come together to debate these international climate accords, they hold a meeting and they number it. So they have been meeting now for the past 30 years to try and create international climate accords and implement them. This conference, specifically COP30, happened from November 10th to 21st in the Amazonian city of Belém in the country of Brazil. Like other United Nations conferences that I've been to in the past, there was both a quote unquote blue zone, which is the official space, which I'm standing in front of in this photo, which is where the delegates meet to negotiate the treaties and where a number of observers like us were in the room. And there were also public spaces for events, like a public pavilion space called the Green Zone, as well as a variety of offsite locations as well. Now, why were we at COP30? Well, the CSJPs have a long-standing commitment to climate action, which I'm sure that everybody on this call is very familiar with. Through chapter acts and the land ethic and participation in the Laudato Si action platform and a myriad of other actions, the sisters have really stepped up to take climate action across the different regions. And we also carry on that commitment through our work at Water Spirit, since mitigating climate change is also a water protecting action. Climate change is a water issue. These actions that we take, particularly the ones based in the US, are more important than ever in a time when our federal government is actively hostile toward climate action. Now, I was looking back through our files. I'm not certain whether the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace have ever had the opportunity to participate in a climate COP before. I know that we were not accredited to the UNFCCC to be able to get our own badges and get in. It is difficult to get accredited. They've been making it more and more difficult for civil society organizations to even get into the conference space in past years. And we're in the process of applying for our own accreditation. But for this year, to get into COP30, I relied on the graciousness of the Maryknoll Sisters and the Presbyterian Church of the USA. So many thanks to both those organizations for helping me get access to the Blue Zone. And I also myself, even though I've been representing the sisters at the UN for 6 years now, I haven't made it a point to attend a climate COP in person up until now. In part because I keep hearing reports back from our frequent collaborators that it's hard for civil society once they get a foot in the door to have an impact, to really make a difference in that space. This was particularly true of the last couple years when the COPs were held in countries where demonstrations or civil society actions were actively being repressed. But as soon as I heard that the climate COP was going to be happening in Brazil, I knew that things would be different. Brazil shows up at moments like this. Brazil social movements are incredibly organized and powerful. And I was also familiar with the city. I did my study abroad semester during college in 2004 in the city of Belém do Pará. So I knew the city. I had the language after living in Brazil for so long. And I knew that there would be specific actions that the social movements were bringing, or calls to action that the social movements were bringing inside and outside of the Blue Zone that I wanted to know about. And I wanted to connect with them, to connect our grassroots concerns in New Jersey and the CSJP's concerns with what's going on in this global scale. So since Brazil promised to be different and more accessible, thankfully the sisters approved me to go. But I know that this being my first climate COP, that I was in for something much different than what I felt before. The climate COPs are much larger UN conferences than anything that I've gotten to go to yet. I've gone to the biodiversity COPs, I've gone to the water conference, to the ocean conference, but the climate COP is much bigger. It's been meeting for much longer, and many of the people who go to these COPs are much more entrenched. So I knew that a lot of what I was doing was going to learn how to be an effective participant in the UNFCCC COP specifically to inform actions in future years. I also wanted to go to pay attention to where the water was. Now, at the ocean and water and biodiversity conferences, I often talk about the importance of remembering climate change when we're talking about the ocean and water and biodiversity. And this time I was doing, the other direction. I was going in the other direction, looking for the water in the climate space. So that's why I'm making this silly little pose next to SDGs 6 and 14 in that photo. Those are the Sustainable Development Goals that have to do with water, both freshwater and life underwater, or the ocean. Furthermore, I wanted to understand the impact of faith-based organizations on the climate negotiations, particularly in light of a new initiative called the Global Ethical Stocktake. And I'll be sharing more about what that is a little bit later in this presentation. And then, as I mentioned before, I also wanted to have direct contact with frontline communities' concerns and their effective resistance strategies, coming from this Brazilian example in particular. So I want to take a moment now to share some of those stories. Brazilian civil society showed up at COP30 as a real example of what an intersectional fusion coalition in action can look like. I heard across the conference that we didn't have climate change action in one silo, deforestation in another, food sovereignty in another, human rights in another. Rather, these were all interconnected, interrelated fronts for action. And civil society showed up with a few very clear calls for the most urgent priority actions. And I want to talk you through one of them right now. The man in this photo who is seated on the left-hand side is a very well-respected indigenous leader from Brazil. His name is Cacique Raoni. A moment that stood out to me when I've seen Cacique Raoni before was when he was walking up the ramp to the presidential palace during Lula's inauguration just a couple years ago. It was a moment that my family was watching from our kitchen table in New Jersey and just weeping because President Lula was back. He was walking up the ramp hand in hand with Cacique Raoni, as well as with a child, a disabled person, a queer individual. He walked up the ramp with this coalition of people signaling that Brazil was entering a new moment, that his administration would once again be listening to the will of the people. And since that was the last moment that was in my head as I was watching Cacique Raoni at these events at COP30, it became even more striking when he was at COP30 specifically to criticize President Lula for one particular action. Days before the climate COP began, President Lula approved permits to drill for oil in the Amazon, right at the mouth of the Amazon River, near where it meets the Atlantic Ocean. How you can, with one hand, claim that you're hosting the COP of the forest, protecting the Amazon, drawing the world's attention to the importance of the Amazon, and then on the other hand, approve fossil fuel exploration in the same place is just a level of hypocrisy that's shocking. And so Chief Raoni led the charge that many other of us took up, that there should be no drilling for oil in the Amazon. It feels pretty basic, but it takes civil society united to promote a message like that. And over the 2 weeks of the conference, over and over again, very clear, defensible position, no drilling for oil in the Amazon. Unfortunately, by the end of COP30, President Lula had not shifted his position or revoked those permits. However, other nations of the world were listening, and that's the potential of something like an international conference like COP. So the government of Colombia, by the end of COP30, declared that they would be the first nation to prohibit fossil fuel exploration in the Amazon region. So we got one of them. We got Colombia. Now the rest need to fall in line. I also wanted to share this photo with you because of the woman who's on the right-hand side. This woman is a federal deputy, which is kind of the equivalent of our representatives, like in the House of Representatives. She's a federal deputy from Minas Gerais state, where I also lived for a long time. Her name is Célia Chacriabá, and I've gotten to meet up with her at a few different UN conferences by now. She has been incredibly active and efficient at pushing through legislation that is protective of Brazil's indigenous peoples. And at this event in particular, she was highlighting a bill that she's helping to move through committee right now that reclassifies environmental harm as spiritual harm. So she gave an example of how that could work. She invited up a leader from the Xikrin peoples, Cacique Megaron, and he spoke about how 4 years ago, a plane went down on Xikrin lands. The Brazilian company whose plane it was, Gol, has let 4 years go by and they haven't gone in to clean up the wreckage. They haven't gone in to recover the bodies. They threw a little bit of money at the problem, not nearly enough, particularly since for the Xikrin people, this wasn't just, a problem of having enough money to clean up the wreckage themselves. Rather, as long as those people are there and that plane is there, their spirits remain in that place. So for the Xikrin people, they've now lost a chunk of their territory that they won't enter. They can't hunt in, they can't grow crops in, they can't, interact with the spirits of the place in the same way because the spirits are now associated with this particular tragedy. So a bill like the one that Deputy Chacriabá is promoting would adequately address that situation. It would adequately describe the scale of the problem. This environmental harm is in fact spiritual harm, and it would allow for a new avenue for redress for the Xikrin people. Now, this stood out to me because Water Spirit has been more and more talking about how environmental harm impinges upon our freedom of religion. We can't practice our faiths on a planet that doesn't support human life. how do we, engage in baptisms if there's not clean water to bathe in? How do we use other kinds of plants in our rituals? How do we care for creation or fully express our religions in places that are polluted? So I'm going to take a closer look at this particular bill coming out of Brazil and see what it might inspire here back at home. I do want to point out that Brazil has, if I'm not mistaken, one of the largest indigenous populations of any country in the world. And so that's why their leadership was so vibrant and at the forefront of civil society resistance here at this COP. One of the main calls to action from Brazil's indigenous people is kind of the Brazilian equivalent of the land back movement. The term for it is demarcação já, so I'll be using the term demarcation. Basically, it's creating legal protections for indigenous territories. Demarcation gives them legal redress as well when there are violent incursions onto their lands from people who want to invade the forest, who want to take its resources for themselves. And really, they are oftentimes violent. So the call for demarcation was present throughout every civil society space. You can see the word that I'm saying on the banner on the right-hand side in that photo, which is Sem demarcação não há justiça climática, or without demarcation, there is no climate justice. And a really notable moment that you may or may not have seen on the news was a day when the entrance to the blue zone was blockaded by some of these indigenous groups. So the photo on the left is Indigenous leader Alessandra Munduruku. And she was really one of the main voices saying, we are going to sit here until we get a meeting with the COP presidency and with President Lula so that we can move forward with the demarcation of our territories. And the amazing thing is that it worked. It was peaceful. The COP presidency came out. There were amazing photos of him with some of the children that they brought along. And they got their meeting. And by the end of COP30, 15 new lands had either been demarcated or moved into the final stage right before demarcation. So they were truly skillful at using the international attention placed on COP30 to advance their nationwide actions, their claims. And when you protect Indigenous people's lands and Indigenous people, you are protecting the forest, you are mitigating climate change, you are protecting water, you are ensuring food sovereignty. All of these are interconnected fronts. So it was amazing to see this direct action really working around the COP space. And truly, I want to give you a scale of how impressive it is that it did work and how brave these people are when they show up. I mean, you can see in the background of the photo behind Alessandra Munduruku, the police presence that was there, the military presence that was there throughout the conference. It certainly wasn't pleasant to be in a space that was so highly militarized. And that latent threat that something bigger might go wrong is just kind of what it feels like to do environmental work in the Amazon. Like the Munduruku people, shortly after this moment, they found a tracker on their bus. There were strange men in suits that were following them around outside of the conference spaces, even inside of the indigenous village that was specifically set up to host people, to welcome Brazil's original peoples. And that kind of latent threat of violence was something I know that I just didn't understand about what it was like to do environmental work in the Amazon when I was down there, in my early 20s. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that right now. So it's been 21 years since my study abroad semester. Belém as a city felt less safe than it did before. At least people were not letting me walk around as often. And I've been told in part that that's because more organized crime factions have moved into the city and into the Amazon as a whole. But on top of that, the Amazon has, a centuries-long history of land grabbing and violence. There's even a specific term for it in Brazilian Portuguese called grilagem, which shows you how commonplace it was for people to snatch up large swaths of land to then either install industry that would destroy the forest, like logging, or like more recent years, planting soybeans or raising cattle Those were the three main ones that would happen on these lands that were stolen through forged documents. And oftentimes, these now large landowners have enough wealth and power to get the local police force or militias on their side to violently enforce the territory that they conceive of as theirs. Meanwhile, Brazil also has a really strong land reform movement and particular legal protections for those engaged in land reform. This is part of why I want to go digging back into Sister Margaret Anna Cusack's writings on land reform in Ireland as well, to see what parallels there might be with current land reform movements that we see across the globe. But, when I was a bright-eyed 20-something working in the Amazon, I thought I was going down to save the pretty trees, and that people who weren't saving the pretty trees were doing so out of some kind of, just ignorance. I just need to go educate them. And I was completely in over my head because of this like entrenched level of violence and corruption. And that's what makes it so much more impressive when groups like the Landless Workers Movement, or MST, do things like take back some of these lands that the huge landowners are not protecting and give them to everyday people so that they can raise subsistence crops and have access to food and get out of the slums and have a dignified lifestyle. But going out to your little plot of land to plant your banana trees and your cassava comes with the threat of violence in these areas. There's a new documentary called Pau d'Arco, which I watched when I was there, but a story that really illustrates that for me, that is very personally moving, is the story of Sister Dorothy Stang. I presume that many people on this call might know Sister Dorothy's story already. But for those who might not, just to give it briefly, she was an American sister of, if I'm not mistaken, Notre Dame de Namur. And she worked in the Amazon region for a very long time. And about the same time that I was there, in fact. I never met her, but as she was, an American working in the same region, her story stood out to me, but I only heard her story after she was murdered. She's considered one of the Amazonian martyrs, which is why she's on this banner that I'm carrying during the People's March in the photo on the left. Sister Dorothy was connected with the people in the landless workers movement, helping them to have dignified life on their subsistence plots of land. And she was highly involved in denouncing and exposing the large-scale land theft that I just described. So for a period of years, on every Monday, she and the man who's in the right-hand photo, Tarcisio, would get together. They'd do their research. They created their list. They came up with their list of about 250 stolen plots of land that they were then prepared to denounce to the Brazilian authorities. They made 4 copies of their list of 250 parcels. 2 of them went with Sister Dorothy, 2 of them to the authorities. And within weeks, Sister Dorothy had been assassinated. And about that time, Tarcisio was also getting threats on his life. So he wound up leaving Belém and moving south to Rio. So part of, being able to be there, and I was actually, I had met Tarcisio at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia last year. So he helped me arrange housing in Belém. So I got to hear more of his story and Sister Dorothy's story firsthand, which was just incredibly heart-wrenching. But what's even more amazing is that he didn't give up. He stays engaged. You can see his shirt says banks are burning the Amazon because nowadays he's involved with a coalition called Forests and Finance. So he and his network are my go-to people when I want to learn about finance, because admittedly, that's a huge gap in my knowledge. Like for me, finance is reparations. Give the money you owe. No, much more complicated than that. But Sister Dorothy's story was moving not only to me, but to so many people especially in the interreligious events and spaces that I was visiting during COP30. So many people talked about her and many of the other Amazonian martyrs. And those are some of the people that you see on the other banners in this march on the left-hand side. So the People's March on the Saturday of COP30 brought out around 70,000 people into the streets. And it was another moment where you could just feel the energy, how united we were behind the realization that there is no future with fossil fuels. This march was led by the social movements, by the indigenous leadership. There were hundreds of people from different faith-based organizations that showed up, and international nonprofits, and Brazilian politicians, and UN special rapporteurs, and just everybody you can think of out in the streets marching together. And the people showed up not only in the streets, not only in offsites events. Yes, there was an offsite event at the university called the People Summit, which was another 4 or 5 day event, which resulted in a list of the people's demands to the COP presidency. There was also this event, the People's Plenary, on the second to last day of the COP. You can see the room is finally filled, not with the representatives of different member states, different countries, but with the people who are there as witnesses, as observers, as participants in the official process. And this was another instance where the people came together to really share how united they were in their understanding that climate change is not an issue area. It's not a silo or a box you can check off. Rather, it is the background against which different interconnected crises are happening. Deforestation and weather disasters and food shortages and poverty and war and killing environmental defenders, these are all interrelated. And you pull on one thread, you pull on them all. Climate action must touch on all of these areas. I heard a particularly moving testimony during the People's Plenary from a speaker from Palestine, whose words were translated into English by a woman from Iraq. They shared, "This is not a climate emergency. It is a peace emergency. Until we dismantle the systems that profit from our death, there will be no justice for the living and no freedom for Earth itself." They then went on to list 4 climate demands, which, given that we are the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, I thought were particularly interesting. 1, they demanded that we count military emissions in climate targets and end the immunity of armies from climate accountability. 2, we then reduce those military emissions. 3, we disarm the fossil fuel age, supporting the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I'll talk about more in just a bit, and ending the toxic alignment between fossil fuels, warfare, and colonial control. And 4, their final demand is to protect those who protect life. Enforce punishment for those who harm the environmental defenders. So you can hear that, especially after this first week when there was so much happening, so many civil society actions happening, I really got that sense of being part of a global us, a global community. But one us that was missing from this conference was the us, the United States. The United States did not send any delegates to COP30. There was one pavilion, I believe, sponsored mostly by the state of California. So, Gavin Newsom showed up for a couple of days, who's the governor of California. But I do want my American listeners to note how much of an outlier we are in terms of the climate denialism that's present in our culture. That climate denialism is just not dominating the international conversation the way it does in country. It's not the global reality. It's part of our particular bubble. So anytime it might feel like too much or feel like insurmountable, remember, it's just here. The rest of the world has already gotten the message. That means a lot of action is possible. I also got the message at COP30 that even without the US there, multilateralism is strong. The world is moving on without our leadership, even though we are still polluting more than ever. And also the absence of US federal leadership said to me that our homegrown actions as members of civil society are more important than ever. Every climate action we take in the US is striking at the heart of empire, and the world is counting on us to do this work back at home. And since my main cohort at these conferences is other faith-based organizations, I do want to share a little bit more about what the faiths were up to at COP30 as well. So the first week, was characterized by an ecumenical and interreligious gathering called the Tapiri. The Tapiri Interfaith House basically was hosted at an Anglican church in the center of town, and it consisted of a number of different panel presentations from international multi-faith speakers, as well as an interfaith vigil and an ecumenical prayer on the Sunday morning. And over again at these different events that I attended at the interreligious house, I realized that there was a common interfaith understanding that we can't practice our faiths on a dead planet. These religiously focused or spiritually focused presentations were also the place where I heard opening to treat nature not just as an object that exists for humans to exploit and use as we will, but rather for interacting with nature as a subject. Ocean as grandmother, rivers as having rights. It was in the faith space where more of those conversations about the inherent subjectivity of nature or its ability to have and hold rights was being discussed. As an illustration of that point, I have this poster that was up. It's on the left. It says, Sem folha não tem orixá. So Brazil has a number of practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions. It's very widely spread down there. The deities in the Afro-Brazilian religion Candomblé are called orixás, and they are worshipped through particular rituals and offerings that involve plants and as well as foods and other materials. So this poster says, without plants, there are no deities. Without plants, there are no orixás. That was for me a moment of really illustrating how fundamental creation care is or protecting nature is in being able to practice our lives of faith across traditions. The faiths were also very present in the Blue Zone, having meetings with the different member states and the representatives who are actually in the negotiating rooms, but also hosting other faith-focused events. Oftentimes at these conferences, I'm involved myself in speaking at events or organizing them. Since my participation in the Blue Zone was contingent upon getting access via other organizations, I was not at the forefront of any events this time around. However, I did get to translate for the secretary of the Pan-Amazonian Network of Churches. So that's the photo on the right. You can see me in the background. The faiths also held another high-level event drawing attention to the bishop's call for climate justice. So that's the cover art that you can see on the left. And if you scan the QR code on the screen with your phone, it will take you to the PDF of that report. This report unites the call from 3 different continents into one voice. Their report shares that those least responsible for climate change suffer the most. It calls out the myth of limitless growth and the commodification of nature. It exhorts the need for indigenous rights and for food sovereignty and for community-led governance of natural resources. And it underscores the urgency of the need for a just and equitable energy transition on a global scale. And it is fused throughout with Catholic support for each of these policy recommendations that they're making. As a cardinal from the Philippines shared during this event, the poor are not an afterthought. The poor are the moral compass of climate policy. So that phrase, heeding the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, was present in this event, present in this report, and present often throughout many of these different faith spaces that I was visiting during COP30. The faiths also got together right at the start of COP30 for an interfaith dialogue called the Talanoa Dialogue. So I got to start off by creating and strengthening this network of faith-based actors. This dialogue pitched questions to us, like where are we going? How do we get there? In terms of our climate actions. So you can see us in the Portuguese language group on the right coming up with our answers to those questions. And on the left, you can see some folks like Dr. Lorna Gold, who's the executive director of Laudato Si movement, as well as Athena Peralta and Henrik Grape, who are with the World Council of Churches. And I also got to go to some faith events that were being produced by Brazilian organizations for Brazilian organizations. I went to one particularly large meetup of the Pastoral Commissions for Integral Ecology, which has been gaining a lot of ground in terms of being officially recognized by the Catholic hierarchy in Brazil. And With these Brazilian meetings, I particularly love that they started off each of them with a ritual combined with prayer, but the word that they use for that is a mysticism, uma mística. It had a certain layer of gravitas to it. So this particular meetup you can see on screen in front of you has a photo of Pope Leo um, with his hand on top of a chunk of glacier ice that came from Greenland. This picture was taken during the Raising Hope conference at Castel Gandolfo in early October. And not only do we have the photographic memory of Pope Leo and this chunk of glacier to remind us of the urgency of mitigating climate change since the glaciers are melting, we also had some of that glacial melt on the altar in those cups that the priest is praying over. And he led us through prayers and chants. It was just a very powerful moment where I could really feel the way that ecological conversion is something widespread and immediate, and not optional for the people who are in the room, which makes sense because Brazil is one of the birthplaces of liberation theology. The phrase cry of the earth, cry of the poor comes from Brazilian eco-theologian Leonardo Boffo. It was then popularized by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, but this is the place where it comes from. So you can hear, especially for during that first week, how many amazing moments I got to have where civil society was really united in what it was asking of the delegates who are inside negotiating the climate treaties. So, with this clear call coming from the peoples of the world, the lingering question remains, why isn't more progress being achieved? Right? Kind of reminds me of the Gus Speth quote that Water Spirit uses a whole lot, where he says that the top environmental problems are not biodiversity loss, um, climate change, and pollution, but rather selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. That's the kind of direction that Water Spirit has been taking for a long time, trying to achieve that cultural and spiritual transformation. But historically, the COP space has not been a place that's been very friendly to that kind of questioning. However, this time, a new initiative was undertaken that is finally trying to reach toward what that cultural and spiritual transformation can and should look like. That process is called the Global Ethical Stocktake. So, this new initiative, led by the government of Brazil, consisted of months of regional dialogues, high level regional dialogues, as well as smaller self organized dialogues that anybody could put together that then fed into a report and a high level event and a pavilion at COP30 trying to answer some of those questions. What is it that keeps us from taking climate action when we have the data, when we have the science, when we even have the finance, when countries are willing to unlock it? Really, we are facing an ethical crisis. So Water Spirit did participate in this process. Back in mid-October, we held our own self-organized dialogue as part of our quarterly Monmouth County Faith and Ecology meetup, and we answered 3 of the 5 prompt questions. You can see a little bit on the left-hand side in the left-hand photo of what that process looked like for us. We had a bunch of Post-its and index cards to answer questions like, what traditions, histories, or practices, cultural and spiritual, from your community teach us to live in greater harmony with nature? And so forth. The Global Ethical Stocktake was continuing throughout COP30. You can see on the right-hand side a photo from a different event that I got to attend and contribute some more answers to their prompt questions as well. So this looks really promising, right? That at a high level in the COP space, these ethical questions are being taken seriously. However, neither I nor anybody I've spoken to yet was able to see a tangible difference in the negotiated outcomes that we can trace to as having been influenced by this global ethical stocktake. Many people felt like it was nice or it was kind of window dressing. Hopefully, this signals an opening to continue these kinds of conversations and taking it more seriously at COPs in the future. Now we're moving toward talking about the outcomes a little bit. I told you that I was keeping my eye on where was the water at COP30. And it turns out it's there on the photo on the right. It was behind me. That's the Guama River in the Guajara Bay. There's very little water inside of the actual blue zone itself, unfortunately. The most aquatic space was the Ocean Pavilion. Now, back in June, when the sisters sent me to France for the UN Ocean Conference, President Lula and his environmental minister, Marina Silva, were very excited about launching their Blue NDC Challenge. For them, COP30 was going to be the COP of the ocean, and they were going to encourage countries to make carbon mitigation commitments that would take into account not only land-based actions, but ocean actions. Which makes sense. The ocean is the world's largest carbon sink. So it makes sense that we would think about the ocean as well when mitigating our carbon footprint. However, by the end of COP30, it became clear that everybody had forgotten about the COP of the ocean. It was now the COP of the forests, or the COP of truth, or the COP of anything but the ocean. And only 17 countries out of the 190 or so actually included ocean actions in their climate commitments. So only 17 took Lula up on the Blue NDC challenge, unfortunately. There was a constant stream of ocean events taking place in the Ocean Pavilion. There was also a virtual component, so there are many of those recordings available online. There was also a dedicated Ocean Day with a number of high-level events, including the launch of the Ocean Breakthroughs Dashboard, an online place to track international ocean protecting actions. And there was a little bit of talk at the high level events about how intelligent it would be to align countries' climate commitments with their biodiversity commitments with their ocean actions. So that's the direction that we want the conversations to be going. Now we want to actually see it come to fruition in the formal NDCs and MBSAPs and other formal commitments that they make. There was some brief hope that COP31 would be more of a COP of the ocean and involve more Pacific leadership. For a moment, it looked like we might have been going to Australia, but now instead COP31 is going to Turkey. Australia will retain the presidency, and we're still yet to see how much influence Pacific people's leadership will have on COP31. I was also shocked to see nobody, even in all of these ocean spaces, talking about the plastics treaty at the same time. And the reason I want to talk about the plastics treaty together with the climate COP is because it's the same bad faith actors from the fossil fuel industry that are blocking progress on both. 1 out of 25 people at this conference were fossil fuel lobbyists. That's 1,600 people. And if they're able to show up here at the COP and able to show up at the International Plastics Treaty, how much progress are we really going to be able to make? They're sending more and more every year. So there's been a little bit of momentum behind the hashtag Kick Out the Suits campaign, which hopes to reduce the amount of fossil fuel lobbyists in the room, if not remove them entirely. So we'll keep you posted on the status of that campaign. And COP30 overall, you may not have heard by now, but the gains that were made were somewhat tepid overall. The final outcome documents did not say fossil fuels at all. They reiterated commitment to the Paris Accords, which was kind of a roundabout way to do it. They did approve a just transition mechanism called the BAM, the Midlang Action Mechanism, which, if well funded, would be a great just transition resource to help the nations that need it most access the financing they need in order to successfully make a just transition to renewable energy. The fact that the mechanism exists now is great. No funding was pledged to it, which is not great. And overall, that's kind of what the COP felt like. So I used the photograph on the left as my metaphor for what it felt like being there. There's a very real tree that they built the blue zone around. It's not getting the sunlight it needs. It's never going to grow the way it's supposed to. Probably pretty traumatized by this event, but there's still a little bit of life there. There's still something growing. And that's what the outcomes of COP felt like to me. There was a document that they published at the end called the Global Mutirão, which attempted to bring the countries a little bit forward in their agreements. Mutirão is a Portuguese word, Brazilian Portuguese. It actually comes from, I believe, Tupi-Guarani, one of the indigenous languages, but it means a collective effort. In my rural community, we only ever used it like the word barn raising, but it does mean like a collective effort. So now the world knows the word mutirão. And Brazil No, the Brazilian presidency knows it didn't make all the progress it wanted to at COP30, but there was this little step forward in a space that is actively pushing backwards. I also was curious to see whether the International Court of Justice's decision back in July that countries have a legal obligation to meet their climate goals would change the tone or change the outcomes of this conference. I would hope they would push it forward a little bit further. And unfortunately, that was not the case. So the question is, what happens next if it's becoming so clear that this COP mechanism was great for creating the treaties in the first place, but has really been falling short, has been entirely inadequate when it comes to implementation and enforcement of the agreements? What next steps are possible? Well, one beacon of hope is an upcoming conference sponsored by Colombia and the Netherlands. It will be the first international conference on the just transition away from fossil fuels. It will be held in Santa Marta, Colombia from April 28th to 29th next year. Um, there's a high ambition coalition of 21 countries that are taking this conference seriously, and that, we're not sure yet because they haven't published yet what can actually be accomplished in these 2 days, what's going to be on the agenda, how to participate, or anything. But it's the direction that the world needs to go in. If the COP process is not going to step up implementation, financing, enforcement, then a mechanism outside of the COP space will need to be created. And this is the first seed of that. This press conference where they announced the upcoming conference was really inspiring too. The speaker from Panama, who's in this photo in a blue coat and a straw hat, shared very straightforward quotes like, even the children in elementary school have books that are more science-based than the text we have here at COP30, where we are supposed to come with the solutions. So I bring in his quote as a sign that there are countries that get it, and they're stepping up to take leadership. And we're in an exciting moment to see where we go next, who is ready to meet the scale of action on the time frame that we so urgently need. So while we're waiting to see what happens at this conference, there is another action that we can all take, and that is to support the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace have already signed on to this, as have Water Spirit, but we can all learn more about what this treaty is all about, talk about it with the people in our networks, and get more and more organizations and cities and representatives and everybody to sign on to it. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is modeled after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It essentially states that fossil fuels are an existential threat that are too dangerous for anybody to have. Its function could function like the Landmine Treaty did. The Landmine Treaty was not signed by all of the countries in the world, but enough bought in that functionally the whole world lost their social license to use this unacceptable technology. And that's what the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty could do for us as well. So if you scan the QR code or type in that link, you can learn more about that treaty. And there are always events going on. For those of us who are local to me, during Climate Week in New York, their organization always shows up and runs fantastic events where you can meet people and learn more about this initiative as well. And finally, we've reached the end of story time with Blair. So I'm going to pull down my photos. Thank you again for your sustained attention. And we do have a few more minutes for questions, comments, reflections. And as soon as I pull down my slides, feel free to unmute and jump on in. All right, catching up on what's in the chat. Thank you for sharing some of those links throughout. Does anybody have any questions, comments, reflections?
Yes, Claire, it's Pat. In some of the coverage I read about the COP30, there was a feeling among the participants that they were relieved and happy that the United States wasn't there at all. Did you catch any of that drift while you were there?
With this particular federal administration, yes, the feeling was.
Mm.
Yeah, I also read some great quotes that were basically like, ciao, bambino. Like, if you're not going to show up and be a grown up at the table anyhow, we definitely don't want you here. It's a rather embarrassing time to be an American in the
Mm-hmm.
United Nations space.
Yep, not surprised.
Dana, do you have a question? I'm not sure how relevant this question is, and I'm not the slightest bit upset that you want to dismiss it. But I'm wondering about the relevance of the connection between the rivers that go into the ocean. I'm, I'm thinking specifically of the Hudson River, which is on
So
the
used
set.
to being little, doing little local things, and one group gave the example of stopping some level of plastic handout at restaurants, county by county in California, till enough happened that the state said, yeah, we should do this. And I'm wondering, with little organizations, Stop the Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty, if you get the feeling that we can get enough of us doing things that somebody at the national level will make a movement.
So I'm hearing two questions. I hear Melissa's question about basically about critical mass, and in the box labeled Gina, I think I was hearing another question in the room about rivers where they meet the ocean, but I couldn't quite hear everything. Would somebody in that room be able to share the question a little bit closer to the mic so I can hear it?
Over here?
Yes.
Yep.
I think it was
Janet
Sister
had a
Janet.
Janice, you could ask the question now again.
My question, I want to acknowledge that it may not be relevant, or that perhaps it has been covered. My question is, can you include the water situation of those who are on the Hudson River or other rivers in this main concern?
Did you get it?
So what I heard was having to do with people who live along rivers that meet the ocean, like the Hudson River.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't catch more of the specific bent of that question, but I'll try and address both of them. I'll address Melissa's first and then yours, and we can clarify if needed. So, Melissa, the first thing I will encourage you to do is to look at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty site, because it itself is not a small organization. It's an international organization with some real heavy hitters supporting it, including entire countries, member states. So it's another opportunity for multilateralism that doesn't necessarily wait for the United States to get the message, which is really encouraging under this administration in particular. As far as, if we sign on to enough, will there be federal level changes? Well, yes. Honestly, that's what we're thinking on every day. Granted, Water Spirit does a lot of our work at the local level and at the state level, where particularly in New Jersey, we can still use a lot of the tools that are in our advocacy toolkit and still be very effective. But at the federal level, what's the option? Rolling over and doing nothing? No, absolutely not. Now's the time more than ever where we need to strengthen our ability to work in coalition and to find common ground across differences, to create a protective network at all levels of action, including at the federal, because people's lives are at stake if we don't.
I guess I
And
was sort
then,
of asking, should I be working with my city, town, local thing, or should I go push the bigger things like the state? That's right. Count all those little things or go after a few more bigger.
yeah, that kind of balance is really a personal question. Where are you feeling the most effective and efficient at this point in time? My inclination is to say, do it all. But clearly you're saying, some of us do not have unlimited time and have to actually be strategic in our actions. So my encouragement is for you to do that kind of strategic thinking. If you can be a frequent speaker at your town, you know that your town government will actually listen if you talk about passing plastics regulations, like skip the stuff, then absolutely push through where your people are friendly to hearing those kinds of arguments. And if your town is not one of those towns, like so many of our towns are not, then you go to your county or to your state level. Find who is willing to be the listening ear and be ready to change as new people come into office. Be willing to shift strategy. And as for the question about rivers and oceans, since I was listening for the water at the COP conference, I in these different ocean and water conferences I've gotten to go to, I've often asked that question, like, how can we remember, the saltwater when we're in the freshwater conference, the freshwater when we're in the saltwater conference, and the places where they meet. It's already strange to me that our water sustainable development goals are separated in the first place. At COP30, I did get to hear from a woman who's a member of a kind of traditional landowning community, not indigenous, but their term for it is Ribeirinho, who lives in a mangrove filled area where some of the tributaries of the Amazon meet the ocean. And there they're experiencing incredible levels of plastic pollution because the plastic just gets tangled up in the mangroves themselves. So she got to share some of their community-led initiatives for remediating the plastics, as well as the policies that they're trying to get passed, in addition to some of the activities they're doing to reseed the mangroves and what's been having success. But overall, that awareness about, we're not separating out water systems, that all the water on the earth is in fact integrated, is not spoken about with as much awareness as I would like to see in these UN spaces. Sister Janet, if that did not address your question, please come on right up to the microphone or send somebody up in your stead to ask again.
Janet, did you,
What does she say?
do you have another question or anything?
Well, I think, I guess,
Use the microphone. Let me see if I can. Okay, Jan.
I feel that we have in the Hudson River a great source of concern for water spirit. And I would use any device to draw our attention to that magnificent Hudson River. Thank you.
Absolutely. I did not myself sit in on any events that talked about the Hudson specifically at COP30, which, might have happened. There are speakers from Monmouth University. There are, folks from the US around. But when I think about Hudson protection, I think about some of the work that Water Spirits Rachel Dawn Davis is doing to keep an eye on Indian Point, which may or may not be in the process of being reactivated. I also think about the great work that Marcellus is doing with the Religious Along the Hudson group, ROAR. We both had the opportunity to join them for a pilgrimage on the Hudson aboard the sloop Clearwater back in September, which was a really, really beautiful event. And just know that the Hudson has not escaped Water Spirit's attention, or the sisters as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, we got a few more minutes. Any more questions or comments?
Any more questions, guys?
Katie, we can't hear you in Bellevue.
I don't know if there's any way to type the question into the chat, but that might be a workaround for the St. Mary Sunset Room folks.
Blair, did China have a presence at this meeting?
I didn't go into any of the events that they ran. They were not on my radar at this conference.
Blair, I was struck by briefly mentioning like spiritual crimes. I can't remember the exact term you used, but outside of that example you gave of the cleanup of the plane that had been downed, are there any other examples of, I don't know, like remediation or repair that have been done by those who have harmed or done like a spiritual crime? I'm just curious. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, it is a pretty new initiative. That's why it drew my attention as well. It hasn't yet been passed in Brazil, this official designation or definition of what spiritual harm would be coming from environmental harm, but I'm interested to see its progress. I suppose the opposite argument could also be made, and something that'd be interesting for us collectively to talk about, that every time that we engage in environmentally protective actions, we're in fact restoring our ability to connect with nature, to connect to spirit, to connect with our own conception of the creator and created all there is. So remembering that as well, that all environmental protection actions are spiritual actions as well. I see a question in the chat. What determines what country gets money from this group? You said Turkey got money. How is it decided? Well, when I mentioned Turkey, I was specifically talking about the presidency of COP. So every year there's a bit of a dispute about where COP is going to be held next. A lot of resources go into hosting a big conference like this, and a lot of responsibilities to set the tone of the negotiations and to keep things on track and to produce outcomes. I'm not sure what threw it in the end. It was really behind closed doors and negotiating between whether COP31 would go to Turkey or to Australia. And then in the end, they wound up with this decision that kind of split the leadership. So I'm not sure what went into that, or what that's going to mean about the tone for COP31, or what kind of progress might be possible. All right, folks, I see that we have gone past the top of the hour. I'm going to most people on this call already know how to reach me one way or the other, but I am putting my email into the chat again. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time with any further questions or reflections or ideas for things that I should be paying attention to for in the future, or people I should connect with, or organizations and so forth. I just want to say once again, from the bottom of my heart, thanks to you all for trusting me to do this United Nations work in your name. Thank you for sending me down to COP30. I do want to also speak again. Many thanks to the Maryknoll Sisters, the Presbyterian Church of the USA for getting me in, for ACT Alliance for serving as mentor in that negotiating space. And thank you all for all of the different ways that you yourselves take climate action and protect water. And remember that protecting Earth is a question of faith. Thank you all, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
I
Have a rest of your day, everyone.
Awesome.